Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, let's go a bit deeper into the 5x5 story that I talked about in my last video. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it up here for you so you can click that and get a sense for what the 5x5 story is. It is a vocabulary building activity that you can do or you can listen to other people doing to help you get more repetitions in and using specific vocabulary words that you need practice with. The idea is that the more times we use a word or we hear a word, we read it, we write it, the more likely it is that word is going to stick in our minds. So that way when we need it, we have it easily available to us. So in this video today, what I want to do is talk a bit more about variations of the 5x5 story that you can do depending on how your learning is structured. So for example, if you're on your own, you can definitely use the 5x5 story. You can just talk out loud to yourself if you're speaking, or if you're writing, you can just write the story on your own. If somebody else has already created a 5x5 story, you can listen to their story or you can read their story on your own. The other thing you can do is, let's say you're working with a partner, each of you can create your own 5x5 stories and then share the stories with each other. So in that case, you get your 5 repetitions of each word for each story that's made. So you'll get 5 repetitions for the one that you make, and you'll get 5 repetitions of those same words for whatever story your partner made. You can do the same thing in small groups, and if you all share your stories, then you get an additional 5 repetitions of each word for each extra person in the group. Now, if you're in a class which has maybe like 20 or more people in it, then you might not have time to hear everybody's story. So what you could do is select a few to share with the class. The class itself could be divided into small groups. Those small groups can share stories amongst each other. Those small groups could also make their stories together, and then these small groups could share the stories with the class. So let's say you have like 20 people in the class, you can make groups of 3 or 4 students, and then those groups could then present their stories to the class. That might be a more manageable way to get everybody involved and for everybody to hear all of the stories. Another way you can think about it is that instead of each person or each group creating their own stories individually, you could have different people or different groups collaborating together on the same story. So for example, you could have a situation where people take turns telling the same story. Like one person gives a line or two of the story, and then they pass the story on to the next person to continue it. So that person would either have heard the story or have read what came before, and then they would add their next part to it. So if it's partners, they can go back and forth like this, or small groups, they can go around in a circle. A class could go around the classroom. This can be easily done spoken. If you want to do it in writing, that can also be fun too, where people read what was done before them and then they can add their next line or two into the story. You want to keep track of all the words that you're using so that way people know what words need to be incorporated in the story, so that way we can complete the entire story using all 5 of the words 5 times each. There's another way we could also think about this, which would be, instead of using vocabulary words, we could use other aspects of language that are super common and honestly make you sound more like a native speaker. So an example of this could be incidental language. Incidental language is language that people use as they're talking to basically keep their ideas connected. But they're not just transitional words, it's also language that we use to make sure people are listening, that we check in with people to make sure they're understanding. So for example, something that a lot of English speakers will say is, you know. So I might be talking and making a point and, you know what I'm saying? Or, you know what I mean? Or just, you know. And that's a way to invite the other person into the conversation to make sure that they're still with me and that I'm giving them a chance to participate in the conversation while I might be saying a lot. So I might, instead of using a typical vocabulary list, I might instead list incidental language that is super common in the target language. A lot of times people, when they're learning another language, they don't think to practice using incidental language because it seems non-essential to a lot of people as learners. But the truth is, a lot of people say that they want to sound like native speakers, and native speakers use incidental language all the time. So to intentionally practice using incidental language would actually help you sound a lot more like a native speaker if that's something you want to do. So that's one way you could use the 5x5 story of, instead of using typical vocabulary words, use incidental language. Another way you could use the 5x5 story is, again, instead of using typical vocabulary, you could use phrases or expressions that people tend to use in that language. Many languages have a lot of idiomatic expressions and common phrases that are used, like it takes one to know one, or the straw that broke the camel's back. That's not something you would typically practice using when you're learning a second language, but these are expressions that are super common in English that help make you sound like a native speaker when you use them. But they tend to be taught as like, here's a list of 10 or 20 or 50 expressions that people use, and these are their meanings. That's interesting to become aware, but it doesn't give you any practice at hearing them in use or using them yourself. So you could use the 5x5 story to help give you some chances to use some of these really common expressions in the target language. And being, just like with incidental language, being able to use those common expressions are going to help you sound much more like a native speaker. And it's probably going to be a lot of fun for you to use that because you know that we say this stuff, you know, like, you know, it gets used a lot, and it doesn't have to become this thing that typically is reserved for the native speakers. It becomes a thing that you get to own too. So I think that can be a really empowering way to use 5x5 story. Another way you could use it is if there are words that you typically have difficulty pronouncing. So you know the meanings of these words, like you hear them pretty frequently and you understand when other people use them. You just get nervous to use that word yourself because you're nervous you're going to mispronounce it. So if you give yourself a chance to practice using those words a lot, those difficult to pronounce words for you specifically, if you use them a lot in a story, you'll get a lot of practice using them. Now, if you're like still unsure if you're gonna pronounce them correctly in your story, you can use this other video I have here on how to practice pronouncing difficult to pronounce words. That gives you practice pronouncing those words, you know, one by one using your fingers, you know, hippopotamus, right? Practice that way. And then you have to practice using them in context, because often what I've noticed in teaching people English is that we might be able to iron out a word on its own, but then getting that word into context as somebody's reading or speaking, that can be trickier. They might revert back to how they did it before. So if you intentionally give yourself practice using those hard to pronounce words in a story that you are making, then you're giving yourself practice using those words in context, and that'll just help make it so much easier for you to get them out the way they are pronounced when it comes time to use them in real life. And the last iteration of 5x5 story I'll suggest is to use gestures. So especially in certain languages, body language is huge in getting across meaning. So as you pay attention to how people actually speak the language that you're learning, and you don't just listen to it, but you see what they're doing, especially with their hands, but it could also be a sound that they're making with their mouth, or it could be something that they do with their eyes, like maybe they squint when they say that, or tilt their head a certain way. You'll start noticing patterns in how people use the language. And so as you're noticing this stuff, you can write down what are some of these patterns. Like, I'll give you an example. When I was living in South Korea, I lived there for a year, I often heard people make a certain kind of inhalation when they were thinking hard about something, and maybe they weren't comfortable expressing an idea that they had, like that kind of sound. And it's the kind of thing, when I said something to my Korean friends and Korean coworkers about it, they often weren't aware that they themselves were making that noise and that other people were making that noise. At least they weren't consciously aware. Unconsciously, I'm sure they were picking up on that and assigning meaning to it. But as somebody who wasn't a native speaker, who honestly the culture was pretty foreign to me when I first arrived, that was pretty noticeable to me right away. So that's something else that if I wanted to sound like a native speaker while speaking Korean, I could make a note. Okay, like this inhalation sound, like, you know, that's something I can start incorporating into my own speech while I'm speaking Korean when the time is right, because it has to happen at a certain time, because it's signaling a certain feeling that I'm having and a need that I have as I'm communicating that I want to express to the other person. So these non-verbal gestures, like audible but non-verbal, are definitely communicating something. So if you've got a list of a few of these that you've noticed in people from the culture that you're learning about and you want to speak their language, if you start incorporating that into your own language, you're going to sound so much more like a native speaker. Honestly, a lot of that stuff, like the nonverbal communication of the sound and the body language, we often tend to just mirror that and pick up on it without having to consciously think about it. But not all people do. Some people will get it without even having to try. Other people need to be made aware of it. And if they want to appear like a native speaker, there are certain things that are going on that are nonverbal that if you can start doing them yourself, you will sound much more like a native speaker. So you can incorporate that as well into your 5x5 story to make it a point to practice it, knowing that it should help you sound like a more native speaker. So I hope these tips were helpful for you. I'd be super curious what you're thinking now about how you would like to apply 5x5 story in your own life. And if you have, how did it go? Let me know in the comments. And I will see you in some future videos more about language and culture. Thanks so much for watching.